So we are back again. This is for become first semester students, and the course is Introductory Microeconomics. This is my second lecture, practically speaking. Now, in the previous class, I had concluded the class with a brief introduction into the working of the market forces and how market forces work to allocate resources in an economy, which is the primary economic problem, irrespective of which type of economy we are talking about, whether we are talking about largely price-driven market economy or a planned economy or a mixed economy. Now, talking of markets, I had also told you that the market forces are basically the forces of demand and supply, and prices are determined by demand and supply, and they're also determining the demand and supply. Like there is a cause and effect relation between demand, supply, and prices. Okay, so and they interplay with each other to come to what we call an equilibrium level of prices, which is, of course, when you hear this word equilibrium, you may think that the prices change and then come to a standstill, but it is not like that. The equilibrium is again subject to change, but when we talk about equilibrium, it is with respect to a certain time period, with respect to certain circumstances or certain environment, and this equilibrium is, as you will learn later during the course, that the equilibrium is itself not a constant state, that is also subject to change. Now, what we mean by equilibrium, we will see later. Now, when I left you with this brief idea about markets, I was proposing to first of all discuss how individual demands are determined, and then we'd have entered into the realm of consumer theory, which would give you an idea about how individual demand curve is derived, and from that individual demand curve we would have determined the market demand curve, and then we'd have seen how demand and supply forces interact. But there is a slight change of plan here, because when I went through the original textbook, I found that for people like you, it would be much better to first get acquainted with the interplay of demand and supply first, because in economics, you know, like we can move from the basic components to the aggregate matter, or we can do the opposite also. We can move from the aggregate matter to the basic components. So when you say, we can first discuss how individual demand is determined, and then we can move on to the determination of market demand. But the other thing is also possible, that we may first discuss how market demand is determined, and then we can move into discussion of individual demand. So let's start with the interplay of market demand and supply first, and let's see what market is basically about. Now, markets are establishments which bring together buyers and sellers of particular goods, services, or resources. And market forces are the factors which affect the prices of these goods, services, or resources. And these forces, as I have already gave you an idea about are, of course, supply and demand. And apart from that, the government. Now, why the government? Because I had also introduced you to a basic idea about the role of government in affecting the decisions of the households and the decisions of the firms, the supply agents and the demand agents, and thereby the government is a major force to deal with. Supply is the amount of a product that producers are willing and able to make available for sale at each of a series of possible prices during a specific period. So there are three things in this definition of supply. First, that the supply is the amount of a product. So it is basically related to a commodity which we are discussing about, and that product must be such that producers will be willing and be able to make available for sale. And when you are saying willing and able to make, we of course are referring to whether it is feasible to produce that commodity. For example, if you say that you want something like that invisible cloak of Harry Potter. Okay, so we are going to make this invisible cloak, will just get inside that cloak and disappear from the world. So that kind of thing is not feasible. So you cannot actually produce that. You can always produce movies on this kind of fantasies, but you cannot actually convert them into real physical form. Okay, so so the willingness and ability to make available for sale such goods, that is also a big factor in determining supply, and at each of a series of possible prices during a specific period. That supply is looked in relation to a particular price level. So if I say weekly price, say Monday, the price of vegetables, average price of course, because there are lots and lots of vegetables in the market, so many varieties of vegetables in the market. So when I'm talking about vegetable prices, I'm talking about the average prices. Suppose the average prices of the vegetables in the market is say 100 rupees on Monday, and on Tuesday it increases to 200 rupees. So when I say supply of vegetables, I have to actually specify whether the supply is referring to the price that was prevailing on Monday or the price that was prevailing on Tuesday. So it is always referred to with respect to a price level. Saying supply of a particular good is so and so, like say 1 quintal or 2 quintals of wheat or rice or anything, it is meaningless unless we specify as to exactly what time period this price, this supply is referring to, and what the price was at that period of time. Okay. Now then, determinants of supply. Price of the commodity is of course one of its major determinant, and apart from that we have other factors as well, and the relation between price and supply of a commodity is given by the law of supply. Now you mark that this is called the law, and I'm not saying any theory or theorem or like that. So law means like it is as it is true. I mean, what we observe as a fact around us. Like I say, the sun rises in the east. So that is a kind of a law, that is a natural law, that sun will rise in the east. Fine. So there is no argument to that. There is no question to that as to why it will rise in the west and rise in the east and not in the west. So it is that kind of thing that the law of supply states that as the price of a product rises, so does the supply quantity, and as the price falls, the supplied quantity also falls. Other things remaining constant. Now, why we say other things remaining constant? Because since there are so many other factors also influencing the supply of the commodity, so it is not necessary that each factor will be operating at one point of time. At any given point of time, all these factors might be affecting supply simultaneously. So to exactly rule out the effect of the other factors from the effect of price on the quantity supplied, we make this assumption, other things remaining constant. Then the price of resources used to create a product help determine the cost of production. Price of resources, and when I say resources, it is actually the resources which are used to produce that commodity. That is the inputs in the process of production, the things that we use as raw material, the factors of production, those we are referring to as resources here. The price of resources used to create a product help determine the cost of production. Then we build into this price the taxes and tariffs which might be imposed by the government on this commodity. Tariffs, what is the difference between taxes and tariffs? Tariffs are imposed on imports, the goods that we are importing from other countries, other economies. And taxes are generally imposed by the people of the economy, the citizens. It might be, say, direct tax like income tax or goods and services tax. But when I say income tax is of course not built into the price of the good. What is built into the price of the good is the indirect taxes, which are imposed directly on goods and services. Okay, income tax also will affect the supply of a commodity, but not through the prices. It will affect the supply of the commodity through another mechanism, through another process. So the price of resources is inversely proportional to the quantity supply. Now, I have a question for you here, that you think intuitively as to why is this so? Okay, why the price of resources or the factor of production is inversely proportional to the quantity supplied? Simple logic. You don't have to think hard. So I'll be very happy if some of you can supply the answer during private chat, if you have time for that at the end of the class maybe, or you can chat with me later on. And if you have any doubts regarding this lecture, please feel free to send your question and answers, which I might not be able to address immediately, but I will definitely try to do my best to answer your queries. Now, improvements in technology allow firms to produce units of output with fewer resources. So technology is another big factor, because what basically technology is a particular technique of production that allows us to use factors of production in a certain combination. So depending on the technology of production, this combination itself may improve in such a manner that our productivity grows. What is productivity? Basically, productivity is per unit of factor production. I mean, if you are employing, say, 10 workers, now your productivity is the total output that your firm is producing per worker. Fine. So of course, other factors are also contributing to that production, but assuming that the other factors are constant, again the same thing, other thing remaining constant, we may find out as to how much each worker is contributing to total production at his own level. So with improved technology, what happens is sometimes the productivity of all the factors increases, or the productivity of one or two factors increases, which in turn leads to better per unit production for all the factors. Now, changes in expectations of the future cost of a product. So not only are the prices affected by the present conditions, but future expectations also matter quite a lot in determining the supply of the product. For example, especially, I mean, this will make really common sense to you since you are commerce students. So because business people basically they are guided by their expectations about the future. If they expect that demand for a product is going to rise in future, they will stock up more of that good. And likewise, when they are expecting the demand of the product to fall in the near or far future. So if the price of a product is expected to rise, a firm may stockpile or produce more of a certain product, thus increasing the supply at a later date. The number of sellers of a product also helps to determine the quantity supplied. And as the number of firms in a certain industry increases, the market supply also increases. These factors can either increase or decrease the amount of goods supplied, thus affecting the price of these goods. So a change in expectation of future cost may affect the supply either way. It is not necessary that if you're expecting the prices to rise, then the supply of that product will definitely rise in future, because it will also depend on how the other firms and the sellers are behaving. And also it also depends on the market condition as to what type of supply market it is, whether it is a perfect competition type of market or a monopoly market, and so on. We will deal with that later on again when we delve deeper into the production chapters. Now, demand is the amount of a product that consumers are willing and able to purchase at each of a series of possible prices during a specified period of time. The law of demand states that as price of a product falls, the demanded quantity rises, other things remaining constant. So these definitions are almost similar. Supply is related to price with a similar definition, and demand is also related to price here. Now, why are we are emphasizing on price of the product first of all, when there are so many other factors affecting both supply and demand? As you will see that among all the factors that affect supply on the one side and all the factors that affect demand on the other side, price is one factor that immediately affects both. Okay, so most of the other factors which are affecting supply, they are such that the factors which are affecting supply do not directly affect demand, and similarly the other factors which are affecting the level of demand, they don't directly affect the supply. So when we are trying to construct a theory of demand, so it is always easier to develop a model with the particular causative factor which is most immediately and most effectively creating changes in the variable factor that we are going to study. Now, like supply, demand for a commodity is affected by other forces as well. And what are those other forces? Most importantly, income, definitely, because built into this concept of demand is the ability to purchase, because as I said in my first class, which most of you did not attend, that when we talk of demand, we are not just talking of mere wishes or need to purchase a product, but also the ability to purchase the product. And if you are wanting a product without having the requisite purchasing power to buy that product, then it is not theoretically demand for us, for the economist. So when we say demand, that means that we are talking about the wants and desires of the people, which can be actualized with the resources they have, and the most immediately available resource is income. Then tastes and preferences. I don't think I need to elaborate on that. So preferences definitely matter in determining both the direction of our demand and also the quantity of the demand. Nature of the product also, like nature of the product in terms of whether it is a necessity or whether it is a luxury item. Generally, your demand for luxury product will rise with rise in income, because luxury products are generally expensive, pricey, and only those with a very high level income can afford to purchase them. So similarly, at low levels of income, the rise in income will induce the consumers to buy more of the necessities. Then nature of other goods which are related to the good that we are talking about. For example, if I say there's your computer, for example. Now, computer prices will definitely be affected by the cost of the material which goes into making the hardware, or the software prices, or the cost of labor in the software industry or the hardware industry, and so on. So demand for one commodity is in many ways dependent on the demand for other commodity. For example, if we talk about substitutes, substitutes are like those goods which can be replaced for their use by another good. So when you say substitutes, there is a range of substitutability between goods, that some goods are almost perfect substitutes, whereas others are not. But most of the goods are substitutable by some degree or the other. For example, the nearest example could be coffee or tea, or your Pepsi or cola, and so on. Now, I think Pepsi and cola are the best example of almost perfect substitutes. So when you are very thirsty, you really can't care any less or more about what you are drinking. So now, the basic relationship between the price of a good and its demand from the standpoint of the consumer is depicted in this diagram, and I hope this time I've got a clear diagram for you. You can see this. And when I say basic relationship, that basic relationship is shown in the in this diagram in terms of the downward slope of the demand curve. You see, even before defining demand in terms of graph or a demand schedule, I am showing you the diagram of this demand curve. This demand curve here is a straight line, though there are curvilinear demand curves also. To make the discussion simple, I think that the author has opted for a straight line demand curve. But whatever, whether it is a straight line or a curvilinear demand curve, the basic thing to observe here is that there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. On x-axis, we are representing quantity. This is Q1 and Q2. And on the y-axis, we are representing the prices corresponding to these two quantities, P1 and P2. So at P1, this particular consumer or the individual is wanting to buy Q1 units of the good, which in this case is music downloads, and at price P2, he is wanting to buy Q2 units of the music downloads. And when Q is rising, that is the quantity of music downloads demanded is rising, the price is falling. Now, there is another funny thing here that even the students at school, they often ask is when we were talking about demand, we are defining demand as if the demand is the dependent variable and the price is the independent variable. Fine. So we are trying to find the change in demand with respect to change in prices. So that automatically makes demand the dependent variable and price the independent variable. So why do then we represent price on the y-axis but quantity on the x-axis? So actually the doubt is quite justified because there is particularly no mathematical reason for this peculiar kind of formulation. It is actually a continuation of a certain pattern of usage which are developed long ago when economics developed as a subject. Nothing to do with any mathematical justification of that. So I think the early economists might have found it more convenient to put prices on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. And then about preferences. Now, how preferences affect demand? That preferences determine the value that people attach to the commodity that they are buying. Fine. Just as I said, you take, say, for example, diamonds, and why diamond is so valuable, and water, despite being a necessity, it has no market price. Basically, the value that you attach to the diamond because of its rarity, and the value that you attach to water because of its abundance. Preference in turn depend on things like weather, information, fashion, and so on. Now, in summers, you are definitely wanting to wear more of the cotton fabric than silk or synthetic. And similarly, most people prefer to wear woolens in the winters. Definitely, the normal people definitely is it goes without saying. Then the change in income, how income is affecting the demand. So suppose you take the example of demand for chocobars. A rise in income increases the demand for chocobars at each price. The demand curve shifts rightward. Before that, there is a little specific thing about price that I should have told you, that when we are talking about demand and supply model in terms of prices, what we are referring to is actually relative prices and not just money prices. Okay. Now, relative prices can be calculated from money prices, but the money prices are not relatively equivalent of relative prices. When we are comparing the demand and supply, we are actually comparing the values of those goods and services in terms of demand and supply, the value that consumers attach to those commodities and the value that the firms attach to those commodities. I think you will remember this concept of opportunity cost that I had briefly delved on. The opportunity cost of an action is the highest value of the alternative foregone. Now, to calculate the opportunity cost, we divide the price of a commodity by the price of the next best alternative commodity and find the ratio of one price to the other. The ratio of one price to the other is called a relative price. For example, if you are talking about, say, relative price of onions and potatoes. Now, if onions are costing you rupees 20 per kg, and potato is costing you say rupees 10 per kg, then the relative price of onion to potato is 2. So which means that in that particular situation, you are attaching double the value of potato to the onions. So definitely onion is more preferred in that situation. Whereas money price is the number of units of currency that must be given up in exchange for it. And the units of currency may be say rupee or dollar, whichever currency you might take up, or whichever currency you are using for your sale or purchase. That is only the money price. But the relative price is arrived at by comparing the money prices, and that actually gives you the comparative value of the commodities that you are purchasing. There is a demand curve illustrated by means of a graph. You can see here, if I can enlarge this for you. This is Helen's demand schedule and curve for latte. Now, I don't think many of you will be fond of latte if you are really acquainted with it. It is for oldies like us. Let's not go into the properties of latte. That is not the subject matter here. What matters is Helen's demand schedule and what Helen's demand schedule looks like. And you can see here that Helen's demand schedule is downward sloping, and the quantity of latte that Helen is wanting to consume at each level of price, the total quantity is increasing, okay, from 0 to 50, but for each additional 5 units, for each rise in price by 1 rupee, the additional units which she is demanding is gradually decreasing. So if you have taken a good look at the diagram, I'm really sorry because my cursor is playing a little erratic now, so that I'm finding it difficult to move to and fro between the diagram and the written matter. If you have already seen the diagram, you can see that there are two ways to look at this demand curve. that on the one side, for a given price, the demand curve tells us quantity that people plan to buy. For example, at price of $3 per latte, people plan to buy 10 lattes a week. For a given quantity, the demand curve also tells us the maximum price that consumers are willing and able to pay for the last cup of latte available. For example, the maximum price that Helen will pay according to her demand schedule for the fifth latte is $6. Okay. So if the fifth latte is offered for $7, then she will definitely not go for the fifth unit of purchase. A change in demand happens when any factor that influences buying plan changes other than the price of the good. Okay, and that we call a change in demand. Now, are you getting this nuisance? This is about this terminology that in sometimes we are talking of quantity demanded and sometimes we are talking of change in demand. So there is a distinction between these two concepts. Now, change in demand refers to a total shift of the demand curve. On the demand curve, the relationship is between quantity and price only. Okay, as per definition, other factors being constant. But when we are shifting from D to D2, this whole schedule, which is D, is shifting to the schedule D2. That means for each price level, say here, for price level 12, the quantity purchased on the demand schedule D is 80. For the same price on the demand schedule D2, the quantity purchased is say 115. This means that when we are talking of a change in demand, we are talking of a change in demand at all the price level that we are showing in the original demand curve. But when we are talking about change in quantity demanded, we are talking about change in the quantity demanded along the particular demand curve. That is, any change on demand curve D, that is change in quantity demanded. But the total shift from the demand curve D to D2, that is change in demand or a shift in demand. So shift in demand, from the diagram itself, you can see that the shift in demand depends on those all other factors affecting demand, which we have already talked about, like income, like preferences, like the nature of other goods and services, nature of the product itself, and so on. And when we are talking about total demand, population is definitely not to be disregarded, because if nothing else changes, then there can be a significant rise in demand because of population growth alone. How future price expectations affect the demand for a commodity. Now, if the expected future price of a good rises and the good can be stored, then the opportunity cost of obtaining the good for future use is less today than it will be in the future, when people expect the price to be higher. Do you get it? Now, if you are expecting price to rise in future, then logically the good is going to be costlier for you in future. So you might, and if you are planning to use that good in future, then it is prudent to keep a good stock of that now by buying it at lower prices. Okay, so generally this is what people do, and that is why we have in times of shortage, people often resort to hoarding. Now, why do they hoard? It is basically this psychology. They hoard because they are anticipating that they will need this product or commodity in future also. And since this product is going to be costlier in future because of expected rise in prices, it is better to buy them now and keep a good stock of it. And as such, when many people start doing this, then the shortage is aggravated, and this is called the hoarding. Then expected future income will affect demand through another channel, and that is credit, especially in today's world when things are being purchased on EMIs. Okay, instead of getting a loan from the bank or the financial institution and then using that money to buy goods and services, nowadays you are directly purchasing commodities on EMIs, like your vehicles or your TV sets and so on. So if credit are easily available and you are expecting your future income to rise, then demand for the goods that you are consuming may increase in the present. And this is irrespective of whether the price is immediately rising or not. Okay. Now, here is an example of how a salesperson is reacting to future expectations about price. Now, if the salesperson is expecting a big bonus at the end of the year, and she is wanting to buy a new car, and she is expecting that the car might be more expensive in the future. So what she will do is she would rather buy that car on credit right now rather than wait until she receives the bonus. So all these factors together can affect people such that they will retime their purchases. Retime their purchases means they're planning about making the purchases, whether they are to buy the goods immediately at present or in short run future or in long run future. Those kind of decisions can be significantly affected by expectations of prices. The quantity demanded and a change in demand is the same as that between a movement along the demand curve and a shift of the demand curve. So when we are talking about quantity demanded, graphically, that means that we are moving along a particular demand curve, and when we are talking about change in demand, we are graphically referring to the shift in the demand curve. Now, please take a look at this diagram. This diagram gives you the movement movement along the demand curve. These arrow marks, blue arrow mark and red arrow mark, upwards and downwards respectively. These are nothing but movements along a single demand curve. And the change in quantity demanded shown by this movement is called change in quantity demanded. Whereas in this diagram, you can see that the whole of the demand curve is shifting from D to D2, and this is nothing but your change in demand. Next, we will talk about the concept of supply. The other big force in the market. If a firm supplies a good or service, we are assuming that the firm has resources and technology to produce it, and it can profit from producing it, and it is planning to produce it and sell it. So there are three processes to supply. First, the firm has the resources and technology. Okay, that is the inputs of production and the appropriate technology to be able to produce it, which is in short ability to produce that commodity. And second, that he can earn a profit from producing it, and the emphasis is on can, that even if he thinks he can profit from producing it, he may not actually. And then third is he plans to produce it and sell it. Now, if you're producing something and keeping it at home for your self consumption, then that is not coming into calculation of market supply or individual supply. Okay, when we're talking about supply, we're definitely talking about things that are actually sold in the market in exchange for something else. Fine. Just as in case of demand, I clarified that when you're talking about demand, we are talking about demand that is actualized. We're talking about commodities which are actually purchased or the consumers are planning to purchase. So similar way, supply also is linked to that whether it is actually being exchanged in the market or not. Okay, production for self-consumption is not included in the concept of supply that we are talking about in microeconomics. That is, apart from relative prices, this is another specification that you must remember. A supply is more than just having resource and technology to produce something. Resources and technology are the constants that limit what is possible. Now, many useful things can be produced, but they are not produced unless it is profitable. Fine. So, if necessity were only the requirement for the decision to produce, then there would be millions of such things which would be produced but distributed for free. Okay, so when we are talking of production, the production is not being done for free, but it is being done for earning profits. Okay, we are definitely not talking of altruistic production or production which is meant for charity. We are talking about production that is undertaken as an investment with a target to earn profits over and above the cost incurred to produce it. The quantity supplied of a good or service is the amount that producers plan to sell during a given time period at a particular price. So it is not necessarily the same amount as the quantity actually sold. Fine. The quantity supply is greater than the quantity demanded. In that situation, the quantity sold is less than the quantity supplied. Now, quantity demanded, the fine. I mean, even if you are, I'm not able to communicate with you, I do feel that you are finding this confusing as to why I am elaborating on this thing, that because the actual cells are not always equal to the intended cells. Okay, when we are talking about quantity supply of a good or service, we are talking about the amount of good that comes to the market for sale, and the sale of that commodity does not depend on the firms alone, because that when we are talking about selling, there must be someone on the other side to buy that commodity. Okay, I mean, because when we are talking about markets, we are not talking about markets uh, which are being frequented by hooligans or gundas who will just grab you by the neck and then force you to buy their goods. Though, I mean, in real life, there have been examples of such forceful selling, and I have been myself a victim of that, especially in Chandni Chowk. So I don't know, that was around 15 years ago. I don't know whether same scenario remains or not, but literally the shopkeepers there can actually threaten you to buy the good, uh, and especially if you have asked about the prices and taken 2 minutes of their time to know the commodity better. So let's not get into that anymore. Now, many factors influence selling plans, and one of them is the price of the good. So for simplicity's sake, we are taking up price as the major factor affecting supply and demand to begin with. Now, Ajay have told you earlier that when we are talking about supply, now supply curve can be interpreted as a minimum supply price curve, that for each quantity demanded, quantity supplied, the related price is telling you that this price is the minimum supply price for that quantity. That is, the firm will supply this much quantity only if he is receiving this particular price for that quantity. Ajay, I have already given you the example. If a small quantity is produced, the lowest price at which someone is willing to sell one more unit is low. But as the quantity produced increases, the marginal cost of each additional unit rises. So the lowest price at which someone is willing to sell an additional unit rises along the supply curve. Now, just like in case of demand, we have several other factors which are affecting supply. We'll take a brief look at those other factors. First, the prices of factors of production. Now, the prices of the factors of production used to produce a good will influence its supply. Now, to understand this, as we have said earlier, that think about the supply curve as a minimum supply price curve. If the price of a factor of production rises, the lowest price that a producer is willing to accept for that good rises, so supply decreases. For example, when the price of jet fuel increased, the supply of air travel decreased. Similarly, a rise in the minimum wage can actually decrease the supply of your home delivery pizzas. Then prices of related good, just as in case of demand. Now, like we have demand substitutes and demand complements, we also have commodities which are complements on the supply side or substitutes on the supply side. For example, leather bags and leather belts are substitutes in production because they are using the same input, goods that can be produced by using the same resources. Now, if a price of leather bag rises, then the firms switch production from leather belts to leather bags. Fine, because on the one hand, the price of leather bag, if it rises, then that will mean that there is expectation of more profit in the leather bag business. And since profit is going up in this industry, so firms will increase their production of leather bags, and new firms may also take up production of leather bags. As such, the total demand, total supply of leather bag will be rising. At the same time, because the leather bag industry is expanding, that might create a shortage of the raw material, which is leather, for the leather belt industry. So on the other hand, the leather belt industry might experience a rise in cost of production and also a fall in demand for its products. And if there is a fall in demand, then there is a lesser possibility of profit, and as such, as the expectation of profit declines, then it further affects its demand. And responding to falling demand, the supply will fall and so on. So this way, substitute goods in terms of supply will affect each other's quantity demanded. Similarly, another example is the price of cars affecting the supply of tires. Now, cars and tires are complements in production. So, a rise in prices of tires may raise the price of cars also, or vice versa. Now, why does a higher price increase the quantity supplied? It is because the marginal cost increases. So you will remember I told you in the previous class that the peculiar thing about the economist is that they think of benefit and cost at the margin. So we are not always talking about total profit or total benefit or total cost. We are often comparing marginal cost and marginal benefit to see where we stand in terms of exchange. As the quantity produced of any good increases, the marginal cost of producing that commodity or good increases. Marginal cost means the cost that is incurred in producing one additional unit of that good. Okay, so it is never worth producing a good if the price received for that good does not at least cover the marginal cost of producing it. Now, what is this link between marginal cost and price? See, what is price? Price is basically the payment that you are making for each unit of the good that you are producing. Okay, when you are saying, say 20 kg, so 20 rupees per kg of onion. Okay, so per kg of onion, unit of purchase is kg here. So per unit of purchase of onion, you are paying 20 rupees. Now, when you are deciding as to whether to buy an additional unit of the product or not, in this case, say if you are trying to decide whether I should buy another kg of onion or not, then you will be comparing whether that additional unit of that uh, purchase is giving you benefit worth that extra 20 rupees that you are paying for it. So this is a comparison of your price and marginal benefit. Okay, I digressed slightly into the demand field. So in a similar manner, in supply side also, we will be comparing marginal cost and the prices. So every unit is definitely going to cost you something to produce it. So if the earnings for that additional unit will not exceed the additional cost that you are incurring, then it is foolish to produce that unit, isn't it? So your supply decision will depend on whether your marginal cost is being covered by your marginal earnings from sale of that unit. So here is the supply schedule for you. You can see in the table that for units A, B, C, D and E, we have prices and quantity supplied given side by side. The first unit, the unit A, is 32 million packets of biscuits at 55 rupees per packet. At 45 rupees per packet, the quantity supplied is 27. At 35 per packet, the quantity supplied is 20, and so on. If we plot this table on a graph, then we'll get the supply curve like this. And this is a typical supply curve which is upward sloping from the origin. Upward sloping means that it has a positive relationship with the price. As the price increases, then the quantity increases. In case of demand, the demand schedule was downward sloping, and there was an inverse relationship. And in case of supply, there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Just as in case of demand, we can look upon change in supply in terms of change in quantity supplied and change in supply. So when we are talking about change in quantity supplied, in terms of the supply curve, this will mean a movement along these points on the supply curve. The movement from E to D, from D to C, from C to B, and so on. Along a particular demand curve, the movement or change in quantity and prices is the change in quantity demanded. Whereas if the supply curve shifts altogether from one supply curve to a new supply curve that is giving you a altogether new schedule of supply, then that is your change in supply. Now, what factors will cause change in supply? Two of the factors we have already mentioned. One is prices of factors of production. Prices of related goods we have already discussed. Then expected future price. Just like in case of demand, the expected future price of a good or commodity will also affect its supply. Total number of suppliers. Supply means here the supply agents are who? The firms. So if the number of firms supplying a commodity increases, then the supply of good also increases. So in any industry, when we talk about industry, we are talking of the industry related to a particular commodity. In any industry, there are always some old firms which are leaving the industry, that is, they are closing the industry and going out of the stream of production, and there are new firms which are entering the industry. So the net addition to the supply will depend on the behavior of these exiting and incoming firms. Then technology is another factor which will cause shift in the supply curve. By technology, again, I have already defined. We mean the way that factors of production are used to produce a good. In what combination we are using the factors of production. Then, of course, the state of nature. There's like your environment, your climatic factors. Fine. So, especially in industries which are based on primary activities like your agriculture, mining, and so on, they are directly and significantly affected by natural factors like say earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and so on. And recently, you have seen how debilitating a small virus can be. And this virus is again natural event, though there are doubts whether it is truly natural or natural event manipulated by some kind of humanity. So new methods used in factories that produce computer chips have lowered the cost and increased the supply of chips. So this is one example how uh, technology can affect the supply of a commodity. A very simple example, which I should have actually placed in the paragraph prior to this. Now, a change in quantity supplied and change in supply is depicted here in this diagram. In the earlier diagram that I had shown you, which is also the diagram of a supply curve, as well as explaining the movement of supply along a particular supply curve. Here in this diagram, you can see the shift in the supply curve. The black line is the original supply curve, and there is a shift of the supply curve to this new supply curve given by this red line. Fine. And this is the example of shift in quantity supplied because of change in input prices. The example is of say milk and latte. So latte basically is a coffee formulation. So milk is definitely used in latte. So if the price of milk falls, at each price, the quantity of latte supplied will increase, because the cost of production of latte will now, since milk is a significant input in production of latte, the price of latte will go down. Sorry, the cost of production of latte will go down, and at each price, the quantity of latte supplied will increase. Now in this diagram, the movement of quantity with respect to prices along a supply curve, which is this diagram, is juxtaposed against a total change in supply, that is a shift in supply from S0 to S1 in this diagram. Now we have explored the factors which affect supply and demand, which in turn are determining the prices in a market economy. Now, if this is so, then what exactly is the price that we are looking for? We are looking for the equilibrium price where the demand will be equal to supply. So how price adjusts to coordinate buying plans and selling plans and achieve an equilibrium in the market, that needs to be seen to determine the equilibrium price. Equilibrium in a market occurs when the price balances buying plans and selling plans. The price at which the consumer's decision to buy a certain quantity is exactly equal to the quantity that the sellers are willing to buy at that price. That is the equilibrium price. So this is the price at which the decision regarding the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded by the respective economic agents exactly match. Now the equilibrium price is the price at which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Simplest definition. The equilibrium quantity is the quantity bought and sold at the equilibrium price. The same thing said in a different way. A market moves towards its equilibrium because first, price regulates buying and selling plans, and price adjusts when plans don't match. So when we say equilibrium price, why is it essential that market must move towards an equilibrium at all? Now, this is because that price, say the price is an indicator or a signal for buying and selling plans. When firms are deciding how much to produce and sell, they are looking upon the price of the commodity as an indicator. Similarly, when the consumers are deciding how much quantity to purchase or buy, they are also looking at price as an indicator. So price acts like a signal for both type of economic agents to take their respective decisions. And the second factor is that the price adjusts when plans don't match. And when supply decisions are not matching with the demand decisions, then the adjustment, the gap between supply and demand, that is being filled in by changes in price. Fine. So how price is a regulator? Price of a good regulates the quantities demanded and supplied, in that if price is too high, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. If the price is too low, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. And there is one price at which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And we have shown this here in this diagram. So you can have a better look at this now. This is your downward sloping demand curve, and this is your upward sloping supply curve. Now you can see that at this particular price, that is 1.8. Now what commodity are we talking about here? We are talking about the quantity and price relationship for gasoline. Okay, and gasoline quantity is given here as millions of gallons, and price here is dollar per gallon. So on the demand curve, you can see that at price $1.8, what is the quantity demanded? So to find the quantity demanded, we draw a horizontal line from this point signifying $1.8 to exactly cut through the demand curve, and this point will now show us the quantity demanded at this price, and then from here we draw the y-intercept, which will cut the x-axis at 500 units. So this means this point is representing a combination of price $1.8 and units of gasoline of 500 millions of gallons. So at $1.8, on the demand curve, it is showing 500. So consumers are demanding 500 units in terms of millions of gallons at $1.8. And with respect to the same price level on the supply curve, the quantity is a little less than 700. Say, let's assume that this is 680 or something. So at $1.8, the quantity demanded is 500 and the quantity supplied, look at the supply curve here, the quantity supplied is 680. So there is a difference of 180 units in the quantity being supplied and the quantity being demanded at this price. So which is greater? Obviously supply is 680 and demand is 500. So supply is definitely exceeding demand here. So this zone, this area in the intersection of supply and demand curve represents the area of excess supply or surplus. So area means that if the farms are producing anywhere here in this portion of the supply curve, then there is a fear that at least some of their product will go unsold. Similarly, this area is the area of excess demand or shortage. You can see here that at $1.2, gasoline's demand is say about 500 because the y-intercept is between 500 to 600 units. Let's say this is 550 units. And the supply is 700 units. Okay. On the demand curve for $1.2, we have 550 units, and on the supply curve, actually on the supply curve for $1.2, we are having 550 units, and on the demand curve for same $1.2, we are having 700 units. So supply is 700 and demand is 550. So there is a net shortage of 150 units. So this area between the demand curve and the supply curve is the area of excess demand or shortage. Fine. Now, what excess demand and shortage will imply in terms of price adjustment? That when the price is in the excess supply area, the minimum supply price for them is below the current price, and that is why they cannot sell all they would like to at the current price. So to sell more amount of their commodity, they must and they have to reduce their prices. Okay. So sellers willingly lower the prices to gain market share at the price at which the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are equal. Neither buyers or sellers can do business at a better price. So if the case is of excess supply, then sellers are forced to reduce their supply price so as to be able to sell more of their unsold goods. Similarly, in case of shortage of supply, the consumers are forced to offer better prices for their purchases so as to obtain more and more of the commodity. So as such, the price rises up to the equilibrium level. So we'll come back to the diagram here. See, now at this price, there is an excess demand. So the excess demand is of 150 units. So those consumers who are unable to purchase that commodity, they will now bargain for that commodity at a higher price. They will offer, say, 1.3 units here to buy some more units of that commodity which is in shortage. Now, when this type of bargaining goes on and on, we eventually will reach the point E at which supply will equal demand. Okay. Similarly, if we are at any point of excess supply, then the sellers have to lower their prices and they move downward along the supply curve till the point E at which their supply decisions are perfectly matching with the consumer's demand decisions. So this is the best price that both the consumers and the producers will get for their respective exchange offers. Now, if this is the best price, we'd expect that this price should prevail. But as we'll see later in our discussion of production theory, that there is more to this equilibrium price than meets the eye. This is only a preliminary idea about how demand and supply adjust to the prices in the market economy and how price acts as the means of reducing the gap between demand and supply, eventually resulting in an equilibrium price and quantity supplied. So all these readings I will make available shortly. Please keep looking at my messages for the links to these files, because these files need a little more correction. I find certain significant errors here. So before making it final, I will have to give it a brush up. And if you have any doubts regarding my lecture today, feel free to contact me. The reference I think I have already given through my chat dialogues. I still don't know if that is visible to everyone or not. Maybe I will upload a file for the reference list also. Thanking you all for your patient hearing. Thank you, Techie Group.